the sweltering heart of antebellum Georgia, where the air hung thick with humidity and the weight of unspeakable cruelty, there lived a woman who understood that silence could be a weapon sharper than any blade, and that rebellion was not always a matter of fire and fury, but sometimes an art form practiced in whispers and shadows. Her name was Eliza, and her story begins not with violence or bloodshed, but with the patient work of observation, with years of watching and waiting and planning, until the day came when the mistress of the house was discovered hanging from her own magnolia tree, and Eliza herself had vanished like morning mist into the depths of the bayou. Before we journey into this remarkable tale, we invite you to share in the comments where you are listening from today, and please take a moment to subscribe and like this video to support our channel as we continue to uncover these powerful stories from history. Now settle in and let us begin. The woman who would become known as the Ghost of the Bayou was born into bondage sometime around 1828 in the suffocating grip of Georgia's plantation system. Eliza was a woman of perhaps 25 years when our story truly begins, possessed of an intelligence and perceptiveness that transcended the brutal circumstances that sought to define and confine her. Among the other enslaved people on the Harlan plantation, she had earned a quiet reputation as someone who could read the shifting moods of their oppressors, who could sense danger before it struck, who possessed an almost uncanny ability to navigate the treacherous waters of plantation life. She was, in the truest sense, an intuitive strategist, though she would never have used such words to describe herself. Eliza worked as a maid in the main house, a position that placed her under constant scrutiny but also granted her something precious and rare: access to information. She moved through the grand rooms of the Harlan mansion like a ghost herself, invisible to those who believed her beneath notice, and in that invisibility found a kind of power. She listened to conversations not meant for her ears. She observed the tensions and jealousies that simmered beneath the surface of white gentility. She learned to read the subtle signs that preceded violence, the tightening of a jaw, the particular tone of voice that meant someone would suffer before the day was done. And through it all, despite the chains that bound her body and the laws that declared her property, Eliza maintained a quiet dignity and an unyielding will that no amount of brutality could break. The master of the plantation, Jonathan Harlan, was a man of considerable wealth and equally considerable cruelty, though his evil was of a particular and calculating kind. He was not given to random fits of rage or uncontrolled violence. No, Jonathan Harlan's cruelty was methodical, almost scientific in its application. He understood that the most effective way to control human beings was not merely through the lash, though he used that tool when he deemed it necessary, but through the systematic destruction of hope itself. He manipulated through fear, certainly, but also through psychological games that left his victims questioning their own sanity, their own worth, their own capacity for resistance. He would promise mercy and deliver punishment. He would offer hope and then snatch it away. He broke people not just through physical pain, but through the careful cultivation of hopelessness, and in this dark art he was a master. His wife, Margaret Harlan, was his perfect complement in cruelty, though she wrapped her violence in the trappings of Southern gentility and religious propriety. She was a woman who took particular pleasure in what she called the discipline of house slaves, especially those who, like Eliza, possessed a composure and quiet strength that she found threatening. Margaret's jealousy of Eliza was palpable and dangerous. She resented the way Eliza moved through the world with dignity intact, the way she refused to be diminished by her circumstances. And so Margaret made it her mission to break that spirit, to find ways to humiliate and punish this woman who dared to maintain her humanity in the face of dehumanization. But the oppression Eliza faced was not limited to the cruelties of the Harlan family. The system itself, the entire machinery of slavery, was a web of control that extended far beyond any individual master or mistress. Religion was twisted into a tool of submission, with preachers declaring that bondage was God's will and obedience a sacred duty. A hierarchy existed even among the enslaved, with house servants often pitted against field workers, creating divisions that served the interests of those in power. Eliza had to navigate all of this, had to understand not just her enemies but the complex social landscape in which she existed, if she was to have any hope of survival, let alone freedom. The catalyst for what would follow came in the late summer of 1853, after years of endurance and silent observation. Margaret Harlan, perhaps sensing that her usual methods of cruelty were insufficient to break Eliza's spirit, devised a particularly vicious scheme. She accused Eliza of theft, claiming that several pieces of valuable jewelry had gone missing from her chamber. The accusation was a lie, and worse than a lie, it was a trap. Margaret herself had planted the jewelry in Eliza's small quarters, tucking the gleaming baubles among Eliza's few possessions, creating evidence where none had existed. The punishment for such a crime was severe, and Margaret ensured that it would be carried out publicly as a lesson to all the others. Eliza was brought out into the yard before the assembled household, both enslaved and free, and made to stand while Margaret enumerated her supposed crimes, her voice dripping with false sorrow and righteous indignation. The humiliation was designed to break something fundamental in Eliza, to strip away the last vestiges of her dignity before the physical punishment began. But something happened that Margaret had not anticipated. Eliza's younger brother Samuel, a field hand of perhaps 19 years, could not bear to watch his sister's degradation in silence. He stepped forward, his voice rising in her defense, declaring her innocence, pleading for mercy. His intervention was brave and foolish in equal measure, and the overseer, a brutal man named Caleb Pritchard, moved with terrible swiftness. Samuel was beaten with a savagery that shocked even those accustomed to violence. The beating went on and on, long past the point of punishment, into the realm of attempted murder. When they finally dragged Samuel away, his body was broken, his face unrecognizable, his breathing shallow and labored. 3 days later, Samuel died of his wounds, never having regained consciousness, never having spoken another word. And in those 3 days, something profound shifted in Eliza. Her grief was an ocean that threatened to drown her, but she did not allow herself to sink beneath its waves. Instead, she channeled that grief into something cold and crystalline and utterly focused. She began to plan, not out of blind rage or desperate impulse, but out of strategic necessity. She understood that she could not simply lash out, could not allow emotion to cloud her judgment. If she was to survive, if she was to escape, if she was to extract any measure of justice for Samuel's murder, she would need to be smarter, more patient, and more ruthless than her oppressors had ever imagined possible. Eliza's plan took shape slowly, carefully, like a spider spinning an intricate web. She understood that she could not simply run. Slave catchers and their dogs made the surrounding countryside treacherous for runaways, and a woman traveling alone would be captured within days, if not hours. No, escape would require more than speed or luck. It would require the systematic dismantling of the power structure that held her captive. And as she observed the Harlan household with new eyes, sharpened by purpose and grief, she began to see the weaknesses in what had seemed an impenetrable fortress. The weakest link, she realized, was Margaret Harlan herself. For all her cruelty, the mistress was also deeply insecure, vain, and paranoid. She craved her husband's attention and approval, yet constantly feared his infidelity. She trusted no one, yet desperately needed to believe herself beloved and admired. These contradictions, Eliza understood, were not flaws to be pitied, but vulnerabilities to be exploited. Eliza began to plant seeds of distrust between Margaret and her husband, a process that required extraordinary delicacy and patience. She would mention, in passing, how the master had seemed distracted lately, his mind elsewhere. She would ensure that Margaret noticed when Jonathan's gaze lingered on a young house servant, even though the glance meant nothing. She would whisper truths wrapped carefully in lies, observations salted with insinuations, until Margaret's natural paranoia began to grow like poison ivy, spreading its tendrils through the marriage. Simultaneously, Eliza began to gather the practical knowledge she would need for escape. She learned the geography of the surrounding bayous and swamps, memorizing every detail shared by field hands who worked the far reaches of the plantation. She noted the routes used by supply wagons, the schedules of patrols, the locations where the watchfulness of overseers grew lax. She discovered that maroon communities, groups of escaped slaves who had established hidden settlements deep in the swamps, existed not far from the Harlan lands, and she began to seek ways to make contact with these free people who lived just beyond the reach of slave catchers. Every gesture, every chore, every interaction became part of a larger chess match that Eliza was playing against opponents who did not even realize the game had begun. When she pressed Margaret's dresses, she listened for revelations about the mistress's fears and insecurities. When she served at table, she memorized the rhythms of the household, noting when the master would be away, when the overseer would be distracted, when opportunities for action might arise. Her work was impeccable, her demeanor submissive, and all the while, behind her downcast eyes, a brilliant mind was calculating angles and possibilities and potential outcomes with the precision of a master strategist. The transformation was invisible to those around her, but it was complete and total. Eliza had become a woman with a mission, and that mission gave her a clarity of purpose that transcended fear. She knew the risks. She knew that discovery meant death, and probably a death more terrible than Samuel's. But she also knew that to remain passive, to accept her bondage without resistance, would be a different kind of death, a death of the spirit that she could not abide. And so she moved forward, step by careful step, toward a reckoning that would shake the foundations of the Harlan plantation and send ripples far beyond its boundaries. Margaret Harlan prided herself on her ability to manage her household with an iron hand wrapped in silk gloves, but she failed to notice that the very woman she most enjoyed tormenting had become the architect of her undoing. Eliza's manipulation of the mistress was a masterwork of psychological warfare, conducted with such subtlety that Margaret believed every poisonous thought that took root in her mind was her own. The process began with small things, observations delivered in the most innocent of tones. Eliza would mention, while helping Margaret dress for dinner, that the master had seemed particularly cheerful after returning from town. And wasn't it curious what could put a man in such good spirits when business had been so difficult of late? She would remark on a scrap of lace she'd found in the master's coat pocket while preparing his clothes for laundering, wondering aloud if perhaps it had come from the dressmaker's shop, though the color seemed rather bold for a respectable establishment. Each comment was carefully calibrated to seem like simple-minded observation, the kind of thoughtless chatter a slave might engage in without understanding its implications. But Margaret understood the implications all too well, or believed she did, which amounted to the same thing. Her imagination, already prone to dark suspicions, began to work overtime. She started watching her husband with new eyes, seeing betrayal in every distraction, infidelity in every unexplained absence. The marriage, never particularly warm, began to cool into something approaching open hostility, and the tension between master and mistress created cracks in the household's rigid structure that Eliza intended to exploit. While Margaret spiraled deeper into jealousy and suspicion, Eliza was making connections beyond the plantation's boundaries. There was a freedman named Isaiah who traveled the swamp routes, trading goods between plantations and small towns, a man whose freedom papers allowed him to move through the countryside without arousing suspicion. Through careful observation, Eliza learned his schedule, and through a trusted field hand, she managed to make contact. Isaiah was cautious, as any black man in Georgia had to be, free or enslaved, but he was also a man who believed in helping his people when he could. He agreed to serve as Eliza's connection to the maroon communities hidden in the deep swamps, to pass messages and, when the time came, to provide guidance for her escape. The communications between Eliza and Isaiah had to be conducted with extreme caution. They developed a system using laundry as their medium. Eliza would write messages in starch on white cloth, words that would be invisible when dry, but would reveal themselves when exposed to heat. The messages were brief, coded, conveying information about routes and timing and the readiness of the maroon communities to receive fugitives. Isaiah would leave his responses hidden in specific locations along the swamp's edge, places Eliza could access when sent on errands beyond the immediate grounds of the plantation house. The system worked beautifully until it nearly didn't. One evening, as Eliza was preparing linens for the next day, the overseer Caleb Pritchard appeared in the laundry room unexpectedly, his presence a violation of the usual rhythms of the household. He had been drinking, his eyes were suspicious, and he demanded to know what she was doing. Eliza's heart hammered in her chest as she realized she had just finished writing a message, the damp cloth still showing the faint outline of letters before they dried to invisibility. She reacted with the speed of desperation, knocking over a bucket of water so that it splashed across the floor and onto the cloth in question, obliterating the message while creating a distraction. She fell to her knees, apologizing profusely for her clumsiness, playing the role of terrified slave so convincingly that Pritchard, satisfied that she was merely incompetent rather than rebellious, kicked her once for good measure and left her to clean up the mess. The close call taught Eliza that even the most careful planning could be undone by chance, and that she needed allies within the plantation itself if her plan was to succeed. She began to cautiously reach out to a few individuals she believed might be trustworthy. There was Moses, a field hand whose quiet strength and intelligence reminded her of Samuel, and who she knew had suffered his own losses at the hands of the Harlan family. There was young Jacob, another field worker, whose spirit had not yet been broken by bondage. And there was Aunt Ruth, an older woman who worked in the kitchen, who had been on the plantation longer than anyone and who possessed a wealth of knowledge about its workings. Building trust among the enslaved was complicated by the reality that not everyone could be trusted. The system of slavery created perverse incentives where betraying fellow slaves could sometimes earn small favors or temporary reprieve from punishment. Eliza knew she was taking an enormous risk by revealing even the smallest parts of her plan to others, but she also knew she could not succeed alone. Her caution proved warranted when a man named Thomas, someone she had considered approaching as an ally, went to the overseer with tales that Eliza was planning something. Thomas had overheard fragments of conversation, had seen Eliza and Moses speaking in hushed tones, and had decided that currying favor with the white men was more important than solidarity with his fellow slaves. It was a betrayal that could have ended everything, but Eliza had anticipated this possibility and had prepared for it. When Pritchard confronted her, accusing her of planning escape, Eliza's performance was flawless. She wept convincingly, proclaimed her innocence with just the right mixture of fear and outrage, and then, with apparent reluctance, suggested that perhaps Thomas himself was planning to run and was trying to deflect suspicion by pointing fingers at others. Hadn't Thomas been acting strangely lately? Hadn't he been caught twice near the swamp's edge, when he should have been working his assigned fields? Wasn't it curious that he would make such accusations now, just when the master had mentioned tightening security? The interrogation that followed was brutal, but Eliza's story held together while Thomas's accusations crumbled under questioning. Thomas had no proof, only suspicions, and Eliza's quick thinking had turned those suspicions back on him. In the end, it was Thomas who was punished, and Eliza who emerged with her reputation for loyalty enhanced, at least in the eyes of the plantation's white overseers. The incident with Thomas, terrifying as it had been, actually served Eliza's larger purposes. Margaret Harlan, who had been present during part of the interrogation, came away convinced of Eliza's devotion and grateful for her apparent loyalty in a household that the mistress increasingly saw as filled with potential traitors and enemies. Margaret began to confide in Eliza more freely, sharing her fears about her husband's fidelity, her anxieties about her position, her certainty that she was surrounded by people who wished her ill. Eliza listened with apparent sympathy, offering the kind of support that made her indispensable to the increasingly unstable mistress, all while feeding the fires of Margaret's paranoia with such skill that the mistress never realized her own maid was the source of her troubles. It was psychological manipulation of the highest order, and it required Eliza to suppress her own rage and disgust as she played the role of trusted confidant to the woman who had orchestrated Samuel's death. Meanwhile, the practical preparations for escape continued. Eliza began stockpiling supplies, stealing small amounts of food that would not be missed, hiding them in locations near the swamp where she could retrieve them when the time came. Moses and Jacob, now fully committed to the plan, helped map out the safest routes through the plantation's fields to the swamp's edge. Aunt Ruth, drawing on her knowledge of herbal remedies and local folklore, contributed something unexpected but brilliant. She began spreading stories among the enslaved community about spirits haunting the plantation, about ghostly figures seen near the magnolia trees, about the restless dead seeking vengeance for crimes committed under the shade of those ancient branches. The ghost stories served multiple purposes. They created an atmosphere of unease that made people jumpy and distracted. They provided cover for any strange sightings or unexplained events that might occur as Eliza's plans moved toward execution. And most importantly, they planted seeds in Margaret Harlan's already troubled mind. The mistress, for all her cruelty, was deeply superstitious, a woman who believed in omens and curses and the reality of supernatural forces. When she began hearing whispers about ghosts on her own plantation, about spirits angry over the death of a young man beaten to death for defending his sister, her already fragile mental state began to deteriorate further. The plan that Eliza had conceived was evolving beyond simple escape. It was becoming something larger, something that would serve as a symbol of resistance, not just for her, but for everyone who suffered under the Harlan family's tyranny. Every small victory, every successful manipulation, every ally gained added another thread to a tapestry that was slowly but surely transforming the power dynamics on the plantation. The oppressed were becoming the orchestrators, and the orchestrators had no idea they were dancing to a tune not of their own making. Summer turned to autumn, and the autumn of 1853 was unusually warm and humid, with storms that rolled in from the coast and turned the air electric with anticipation. The atmosphere on the Harlan plantation had become charged in a different way, heavy with tensions that no one could quite name but everyone could feel. Margaret Harlan's behavior had become increasingly erratic, swinging between manic gaiety and dark depression, between paranoid accusations and desperate attempts to prove herself beloved. Her relationship with her husband had deteriorated to the point of open conflict, with arguments that echoed through the house and scandalized the neighboring plantation families who heard the gossip through their own house servants. Eliza watched it all unfold with the satisfaction of an artist, seeing her work approach completion, but she knew the most dangerous part was yet to come. The actual escape would require perfect timing, perfect execution, and more than a little luck. She continued to refine her plans, to adjust for changing circumstances, to prepare for contingencies. She met one final time with Isaiah, who brought word that the Maroon community was ready to receive her and her companions, that guides would be watching for them at a specific location on a specific night, that everything was in place. The night they chose was deliberately selected for its strategic advantages. A storm was forecasted, which would make tracking difficult and provide cover for their movements. The master was scheduled to be away on business, reducing the number of white men on the property, and most significantly, it was a night when Margaret Harlan's fear and paranoia had been carefully cultivated to reach a crescendo. What happened that night, the night of October 14, 1853, would be spoken of in whispers for generations to come, though the exact truth would forever remain shrouded in mystery and speculation. What is known is this: as thunder rolled across the Georgia sky and rain lashed the plantation house, Margaret Harlan left her room sometime in the early hours before dawn. Some said she had been walking the grounds in recent nights, unable to sleep, tormented by nightmares and visions. Some said she had been drinking heavily, trying to quiet the voices in her head that told her she was surrounded by enemies both living and dead. When the morning came and the storm cleared, a house servant went to wake the mistress and found her bed empty, the sheets cold. A search of the house revealed nothing. It was a field hand going to begin the day's work who found Margaret Harlan hanging from the magnolia tree near the quarters, the same tree where Samuel had been tied during his fatal beating, the same tree that had featured so prominently in Aunt Ruth's ghost stories. The sight was horrifying in its symmetry, in its suggestion of poetic justice or supernatural vengeance. The death was ruled a suicide, a judgment that seemed to fit with Margaret's known mental instability, her increasingly bizarre behavior in the weeks leading up to her death. But there were whispers, always whispers. Some claimed they had seen a figure in white near the tree that night, a ghostly presence that might have been a spirit or might have been something more earthly. Others said they had seen Eliza near the magnolia trees earlier in the evening, though whether this was memory or imagination, no one could say for certain. What was indisputable was that when the household finally turned its attention from the mistress's death to the daily operations of the plantation, they discovered that Eliza was gone. Her small room was empty, her few possessions vanished, her bed cold as if it had not been slept in for days, and she was not alone in her disappearance. Moses and Jacob were also missing from the fields, and various small items had vanished from storage: food, rope, a knife from the kitchen, items that would be useful for survival in the wilderness. Jonathan Harlan, returning to find his wife dead and his slaves escaped, fell into a rage that bordered on madness. He summoned slave catchers with their dogs, offered enormous rewards, swore vengeance on anyone who had aided the fugitives. The slave catchers searched for days, their dogs following trails that led into the swamp, and then vanished as if Eliza and her companions had sprouted wings and flown away. The rewards went unclaimed. The fugitives seemed to have been swallowed whole by the bayou, leaving no trace, no trail, nothing but absence and unanswered questions. The overseer Caleb Pritchard took the escapes as a personal affront, a challenge to his authority and competence. He drove himself and his men relentlessly in the search, pushing deeper into the swamp than was safe or wise. And then, 3 weeks after the escape, Pritchard's body was discovered in a shallow channel of the bayou, his throat cut, his body already being reclaimed by the dark waters and the creatures that dwelt there. No one was ever charged with his murder. No one ever claimed responsibility, but everyone knew in that way that knowledge spreads through whispers and silences that justice had been done. The Harlan plantation, already reeling from the mistress's death and the slave's escape, began to fall apart. Emboldened by Eliza's successful defiance, other enslaved people on the plantation began their own subtle acts of rebellion. Tools disappeared or broke mysteriously. Work slowed. Fires started in barns and fields, small enough not to threaten lives but large enough to cause significant economic damage. Jonathan Harlan, who had once ruled his domain with such iron control, found that control slipping through his fingers like water through a sieve. The neighboring planters watched the Harlan plantation's decline with a mixture of satisfaction and alarm. Satisfaction because Jonathan Harlan had never been well liked among his peers, his cruelty excessive even by the standards of men who built their fortunes on human bondage. Alarm because the story of Eliza and her escape was spreading, carried by the network of enslaved people who moved between plantations, whispered in kitchens and fields and quarters, transforming from simple fact into something approaching legend. Within months of the escape, stories began to circulate of a woman in white, seen in the swamps, a figure who would appear to fugitive slaves and guide them to safety, leading them through paths known only to those who had mastered the bayou's treacherous geography. Some called her a ghost, the spirit of a woman who had died seeking freedom. Others insisted she was flesh and blood, that Eliza had not just escaped but had found her way to the maroon communities and now worked actively to help others follow in her footsteps. The truth, as is so often the case with such stories, likely lay somewhere between legend and reality, but the power of the story was independent of its literal accuracy. The ghost of the bayou became a symbol of hope, proof that escape was possible, that the master's power was not absolute, that intelligence and courage could triumph over brutality and oppression. Slave catchers complained that the mere mention of the ghost made their work harder, as runaways seemed to navigate the swamps with a confidence and knowledge that suggested they had supernatural aid, or at least very earthly help, from someone who knew the territory intimately. Jonathan Harlan never recovered from the series of catastrophes that befell him in the autumn of 1853. His wife's death haunted him, not because he grieved her loss, but because the manner of her death and the mysterious circumstances surrounding it had tarnished his reputation beyond repair. His fellow planters whispered that his household had been cursed, that he had pushed his cruelty too far and called down divine or demonic retribution. His slaves were increasingly unmanageable, and other planters were reluctant to purchase them, fearing they would bring their rebellious spirit to new plantations. Within 5 years, the Harlan plantation was sold, broken up, its fields divided among multiple buyers who saw opportunity in acquiring good land at distressed prices. The great house where Eliza had worked as a maid fell into disrepair, its windows broken, its rooms empty, its halls silent. The magnolia trees, those ancient witnesses to so much suffering, continued to grow, their roots reaching deep into soil that had been watered with tears and blood, their branches spreading wide over ground where human beings had been treated as property and where, finally, one woman had said, "Enough." The immediate aftermath of Eliza's escape reverberated through Georgia and beyond, but the full measure of her legacy would only become clear over decades and generations. In the years following her disappearance, the Stories about the ghost of the Bayou continued to spread and evolve, taking on new details with each retelling, becoming part of the oral tradition that sustained hope among enslaved people throughout the South. During the desperate years leading up to the Civil War, when tensions between North and South escalated toward inevitable conflict, the story of Eliza was told and retold in secret gatherings, in the quiet hours after work, in whispered conversations between people who dared to imagine a different future. It became a parable about resistance, about the power of intelligence over brute force, about the importance of patience and planning in the face of overwhelming odds. When war finally came and the Union Army began its campaigns through the South, freed people who encountered Northern soldiers often shared stories about local heroes of resistance, and the name of Eliza came up again and again. Some Union officers recorded these stories in their journals and letters, fascinated by tales of a woman who had engineered not just her own escape, but the psychological destruction of her oppressors. These accounts, fragmentary and often contradictory, ensured that Eliza's story was preserved in written form, even as the oral tradition continued to evolve. The Reconstruction era brought its own challenges and disappointments, as the promise of freedom was compromised by the realities of continued racism and economic exploitation. But it also brought opportunities for freed people to openly celebrate their heroes and to pass their stories on to new generations without fear of punishment. Around fires and in churches, at family gatherings and community celebrations, the story of Eliza was told with pride. She became a symbol not just of escape, but of dignity, of the refusal to be diminished by circumstances, of the truth that the human spirit could not be owned no matter how the law defined property rights. Some families claimed direct descent from Eliza, though whether these claims were historically accurate mattered less than what they represented. A connection to courage, a lineage of resistance, a bloodline that carried the memory of someone who had refused to accept enslavement as her permanent condition. The name Eliza became popular among freed people in Georgia and Louisiana, a way of honoring her memory and claiming her legacy. Even those who could not trace their ancestry to her specifically saw her as a spiritual ancestor, someone whose struggle and triumph belonged to all who had survived the horrors of bondage. The ghost stories, interestingly, persisted alongside the more historical accounts. Well into the 20th century, there were people in the Bayou regions of Georgia and Louisiana who swore they had seen a woman in white moving through the swamps, who claimed to have been guided to safety or warned of danger by a presence that could not quite be explained by rational means. Whether these sightings were genuine supernatural phenomena, cases of mistaken identity, or simply the power of suggestion and cultural memory at work, they served to keep Eliza's story alive in a way that pure historical fact might not have done. Scholars and historians who later attempted to document the facts of Eliza's life found precious few hard records. She existed in the margins of official documentation, mentioned in plantation ledgers as property, noted in passing in a few letters and diary entries, but never granted the dignity of a full biographical record. The death of Margaret Harlan was documented, of course, and there were records of slaves who went missing from the Harlan plantation, but connecting these fragments into a complete and verifiable narrative proved impossible. This absence of documentation was itself a testament to the reality of slavery, to the way the system worked to erase the humanity and individuality of those it enslaved. Yet the lack of conventional historical documentation did not mean that Eliza's story was untrue or unimportant. The oral histories passed down through generations of freed people, and their descendants carried their own form of truth, a truth about lived experience and collective memory that official records could never capture. The story of Eliza was true in the ways that mattered most. It was true to the experience of enslaved women who used their intelligence as a weapon, true to the reality that resistance took many forms beyond open rebellion, true to the fact that even in the darkest circumstances, human beings found ways to assert their agency and fight for their freedom. As the 20th century progressed and the civil rights movement brought renewed attention to the history of slavery and resistance, scholars began to take oral histories more seriously as historical sources. The stories about Eliza and others like her were collected and analyzed, seen not as quaint folklore but as valuable documentation of how enslaved people understood their own history and celebrated their ancestors' courage. Academic conferences featured papers about resistance on southern plantations, and Eliza's name appeared in scholarly works, alongside other figures who had fought against slavery through intelligence and strategic action rather than, or in addition to, armed revolt. In recent decades, there have been efforts to memorialize Eliza and others whose acts of resistance helped lay the groundwork for freedom. Historical markers have been placed near the site of the former Harlan plantation, though the exact location of key events remains a matter of some speculation. Museums dedicated to African American history have created exhibits exploring the many forms that resistance took during the era of slavery, and Eliza's story features prominently in these exhibitions. Artists have created paintings and sculptures inspired by her legend. Writers have penned novels and poems imagining her thoughts and feelings, and filmmakers have explored her story. Through documentary and dramatic works, the magnolia tree where Margaret Harlan died no longer stands, victim of time and weather and the natural cycle of growth and decay, but the site where it once grew has become a kind of pilgrimage destination for those who want to honor Eliza's memory. Visitors leave flowers and tokens, small gestures of respect for a woman they never knew, but whose courage speaks across the centuries. In this way, the story continues to live and evolve, continues to inspire new generations who face their own forms of injustice and oppression. What makes Eliza's story particularly powerful is not just what she did, but how she did it. She understood that in a system designed to strip enslaved people of agency and dignity, the simple act of thinking strategically, of planning methodically, of using the oppressor's own tools against them was itself a profound form of resistance. She recognized that Margaret Harlan's vanity and paranoia were weapons that could be turned back on her, that Jonathan Harlan's psychological cruelty created vulnerabilities in his own system of control. She saw that the appearance of submission could mask the reality of rebellion, that silence could be a strategy rather than a surrender. In an era that often celebrated only the most dramatic forms of resistance, the armed revolts and physical confrontations, Eliza's story reminds us that rebellion can be as quiet as a whisper, as patient as time, as subtle as the planting of an idea in a vulnerable mind. She played a long game, understanding that true victory required not just escaping herself, but dismantling the structures that enabled her oppression. The destruction of the Harlan family's power, the inspiration she provided to others, the legacy of courage she left behind. These were achievements that went far beyond simple self-preservation. Her story also speaks to the particular challenges faced by enslaved women who had to navigate not just racial oppression, but also gender-based vulnerabilities and exploitation. Margaret Harlan's jealousy of Eliza, her need to dominate and humiliate another woman, reflected the complex ways that slavery distorted relationships between women across racial lines. Eliza's ability to manipulate these dynamics, to turn Margaret's own insecurities against her, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of power and psychology that defied every stereotype about enslaved people's supposed intellectual inferiority. The question of what exactly happened on the night of Margaret Harlan's death has never been definitively answered, and perhaps that ambiguity is appropriate. Whether Margaret took her own life in a moment of madness, whether she was helped to her death by human hands, or whether, as some insisted, supernatural forces intervened, the truth is that the seeds of her destruction were planted by Eliza's patient work over months and years. The specific mechanism of her death is less important than the larger truth, that she was undone by the same cruelty and paranoia that she had wielded against others, and that Eliza was the architect of that undoing. Similarly, we cannot know with certainty what became of Eliza after she vanished into the bayou. Did she reach the maroon communities and live out her days in freedom, hidden in the swamps beyond the reach of slave catchers? Did she continue her work as the ghost of the bayou, guiding other fugitives to safety until old age or illness finally claimed her? Did she eventually make her way north, perhaps along the Underground Railroad, to find a new life in a free state? The historical record offers no answers, only possibilities, and perhaps that too is fitting. Eliza spent her life in bondage, being defined and documented as property, her existence recorded only in the ledgers of those who claimed to own her. In freedom, she became undocumented, undefined by anyone's records but her own, her story living in the hearts and memories of those who needed to believe that escape was possible, that justice could be claimed, that the human spirit could not be broken. The maroon communities that existed in the swamps of Georgia and Louisiana during the antebellum period were remarkable societies in their own right, composed of people who had rejected enslavement and built lives of freedom in one of the most inhospitable environments imaginable. These communities were organized, structured with their own systems of governance and defense, their own methods of agriculture and survival adapted to the unique conditions of the swamplands. They maintained networks of communication with enslaved people on nearby plantations, trading information and occasionally goods, serving as living proof that alternatives to bondage existed even in the heart of slave territory. If Eliza did reach such a community, and the evidence suggests strongly that she did, she would have found herself among kindred spirits, people who had chosen the hardships of freedom over the security of submission. These communities valued intelligence and resourcefulness, qualities Eliza possessed in abundance. It is not difficult to imagine her thriving in such an environment, perhaps even rising to a position of leadership, using the same strategic thinking that had enabled her escape to help protect and sustain her new community. The stories about the ghost of the bayou guiding fugitives to safety suggest someone with intimate knowledge of both the plantation system and the geography of freedom, someone who had made the journey herself and was committed to helping others follow. The broader historical context of Eliza's story is important to understand. She lived and acted during a period when the institution of slavery in the United States was approaching its crisis point, when the contradictions between the nation's founding ideals of liberty and equality and the reality of millions held in bondage were becoming increasingly impossible to ignore or reconcile. The 1850s were years of intense debate over slavery's expansion into new territories, of increasingly stringent fugitive slave laws that made even the North unsafe for escaped slaves, of growing tensions that would eventually explode into civil war. In this context, every successful escape, every act of resistance, every demonstration that enslaved people were fully human and capable of extraordinary intelligence and courage carried political significance beyond the individual circumstances. Pro-slavery advocates based their arguments in part on the claim that people of African descent were naturally inferior, suited by nature for subordination, and incapable of the kind of complex reasoning required for self-governance. Every Eliza who emerged, every person who demonstrated through their actions that these racist assumptions were lies weakened the intellectual foundations of slavery itself. The story spread not just among enslaved people, but also in abolitionist circles in the North. Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and other prominent abolitionists understood the power of individual stories to change hearts and minds, to put a human face on the abstract concept of slavery. While Eliza never achieved the fame of these figures, never had the opportunity to tell her own story in her own words, as Douglass did in his autobiographies, her legend nonetheless contributed to the growing body of evidence that slavery was not only morally wrong, but practically unsustainable, that enslaved people would never stop resisting, never stop seeking freedom, never accept their bondage as natural or permanent. The Civil War, when it finally came, brought an end to legal slavery, but not to the struggle for true freedom and equality. The promises of Reconstruction were betrayed, and formerly enslaved people found themselves facing new forms of oppression. Sharecropping that recreated many of slavery's economic dynamics, Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation and discrimination, terrorist violence from groups like the Ku Klux Klan designed to maintain white supremacy through fear. In these difficult years, stories like Eliza's took on new significance, reminding people that resistance was possible, that dignity could be maintained even under oppression, that strategic thinking and courage could overcome even the most entrenched systems of power. The great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren of the people Eliza had known, the descendants of those who had heard her story firsthand, carried that story forward into the 20th century. They told it during the dark years of Jim Crow, when racial violence and discrimination seemed as insurmountable as slavery had once seemed. They told it during the Civil Rights Movement, when a new generation took up the struggle for equality and found inspiration in the courage of their ancestors. They tell it still today, in a world where the struggle for racial justice continues, where the legacy of slavery still shapes American society in profound and often painful ways. What lessons does Eliza's story hold for us today, looking back across more than a century and a half? Perhaps the most important is that resistance takes many forms, and that intelligence, patience, and strategic thinking are sometimes more powerful than physical force alone. In our own time, when people around the world continue to face various forms of oppression and injustice, Eliza's example reminds us that the fight for freedom requires not just courage, but also careful planning, not just passion, but also clear-eyed assessment of power dynamics and vulnerabilities in systems of control. Her story also speaks to the power of narrative itself, the way that stories shape identity and inspire action. Eliza's legend, whether completely factually accurate in every detail or not, provided generations of people with a template for resistance, a model of how to fight back against injustice using all the tools available, including psychological warfare and strategic manipulation. The story gave people hope in hopeless circumstances, reminded them of their own agency, even when the system sought to deny that agency at every turn. There is something profound, too, in the fact that Eliza's story survives primarily through oral tradition rather than official documentation. The written historical record was controlled by those in power, by slaveholders and their apologists, by people who had every interest in portraying enslaved people as passive victims rather than active agents of their own liberation. The oral tradition preserved a different truth, one that centered the experiences and perspectives of the oppressed themselves, that celebrated their intelligence and courage, that refused to let their stories be erased by a system that sought to deny their very humanity. In recent years, historians have worked to recover and amplify these oral traditions, to treat them not as inferior sources of information, but as vital testimonies that provide perspectives unavailable in conventional archives. This methodological shift has enriched our understanding of slavery and resistance immeasurably, revealing a much more complex and nuanced picture than the simple narrative of helpless victims and benevolent liberators that once dominated popular understanding. Eliza's story is part of this larger project of historical recovery, of insisting that the voices and experiences of enslaved people themselves must be centered in how we understand and teach this history. The ghost of the Bayou, whether a literal presence or a powerful metaphor, represents something essential about the human spirit: its refusal to be completely dominated, its capacity to find freedom even in the most constrained circumstances, its ability to transform suffering into strategic action. Eliza's ghost haunts the old Harlan plantation not as a figure of terror but as a reminder of justice, deferred but not denied, of accounts that must eventually be settled, of the truth that systems of oppression carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. When we consider the magnitude of what Eliza accomplished, starting from a position of complete legal powerlessness, with no resources except her own intelligence and the solidarity of a few trusted allies, the achievement becomes even more remarkable. She had no weapons except her mind, no wealth except her courage, no authority except what she could claim for herself through sheer force of will. And yet she brought down a powerful family, escaped to freedom, and inspired countless others to resist their own oppression. This is the power of human agency at its most fundamental, the irreducible capacity of individuals to shape their own destinies, even in the face of overwhelming obstacles. Her story also illuminates an important truth about systems of oppression. They depend ultimately on the psychological submission of the oppressed, on convincing people that resistance is futile and that their subordinate position is natural or inevitable or divinely ordained. When that psychological domination is broken, when people begin to see themselves as agents rather than victims, as strategists rather than pawns, the system becomes vulnerable in ways that all the guns and laws and economic power in the world cannot fully protect against. Eliza understood this at a deep level, understood that the battle for freedom was fought first in the mind, and that winning that internal battle was prerequisite to any external victory. The relationship between individual action and collective liberation is complex, and Eliza's story illuminates that complexity. She could not, by herself, end slavery or fundamentally transform the system that oppressed her and millions of others, but her individual act of resistance rippled outward, inspiring others, demonstrating possibilities, creating small cracks in what had seemed an impenetrable wall. These individual acts of resistance, multiplied across thousands of people and many years, created the conditions that eventually made slavery's destruction possible. No single person could bring down the entire system, but each person who resisted weakened it, and the accumulation of that resistance eventually became irresistible. In remembering Eliza today, we honor not just one woman's courage, but the courage of all who resisted slavery in its many forms. We acknowledge the intelligence and strategic thinking of people whom the law defined as property, but who never accepted that definition, who maintained their sense of self and their claims to freedom even when the entire weight of society denied those claims. We recognize that the fight for justice is often long and difficult, that victories may be partial and incomplete, that the work of liberation requires patience and planning as much as passion and commitment. And we remind ourselves that the story is not finished, that the struggle for true equality and justice continues, that each generation must take up the work of resistance, against whatever forms of oppression and injustice it faces. Eliza's ghost still walks, not just in the swamps of Georgia, but wherever people fight for their dignity and freedom, wherever intelligence is deployed against brutality, wherever strategic patience confronts overwhelming force, wherever human beings refuse to accept their assigned place in hierarchies of power. In the sweltering heart of what was once antebellum Georgia, where the old Harlan plantation has long since returned to forest and swamp, where the magnolia trees still grow and the Bayou waters still flow dark and mysterious, the legend endures. Mothers tell their daughters about the woman who would not be broken, who turned her oppressors' weapons against them, who vanished into freedom and perhaps never stopped helping others find their way to that same precious liberation. Fathers tell their sons about the importance of thinking strategically, of using every tool available, of never accepting injustice as permanent or inevitable. And on certain nights, when the moon is full and the mist rises from the swamp waters, people still claim to see a figure in white moving through the shadows, still hear whispers carried on the wind that might be voices from the past, or might be the eternal call of freedom itself. Whether these sightings are real or imagined matters less than what they represent. The enduring power of Eliza's story, the refusal to let her memory fade, the insistence that her courage and intelligence be honored and remembered and celebrated. Eliza of Georgia, enslaved woman, strategist, liberator, legend. Her story reminds us that the human spirit cannot be owned, that dignity cannot be taken away no matter what the law says, that freedom is not granted by those in power, but claimed by those with the courage to seize it. Her legacy lives on in every act of resistance against injustice, in every strategic move against oppression, in every person who refuses to accept their assigned place in systems of domination. She vanished into the Bayou more than 170 years ago, but her presence remains, a ghost that haunts not with terror, but with hope, not with sorrow, but with triumph. She reminds us that we are all capable of more than we know, that circumstances do not define us, that intelligence and courage and patient determination can overcome even the most terrible odds. And in that reminder lies a challenge and an inspiration for our own time, a call to take up the work of justice and liberation that she began, to honor her memory not just with words, but with action, to ensure that her struggle and her triumph continue to echo through the generations until the day when all people are truly free. This is the story of Eliza of Georgia, the woman who turned silence into a weapon, who made an art form of rebellion, who vanished into the Bayou after the master's wife was found hanging, and whose spirit has never stopped walking the paths to freedom.